Welcome to the Take Action podcast, where we empower communication partners to feel confident with AAC. I am Lauren Greenleaf, a certified speech-language pathologist with nearly a decade of experience in AAC. Join us weekly as we dive into all of the aspects of AAC and hear from communication partners just like you who are successfully integrating AAC into their daily lives. Whether you are an SLP, a parent, an educator, or any other communication partner, you are absolutely in the right place if you are ready to take actionable steps towards AAC success today. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Take Action podcast. This week, I am here with Sara, and she is a speech therapist in Ohio and also has an upbringing in the AAC world. So, Sara, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Me too. I'm so excited for our chat. Just even the little bit that happened before I pressed record, I can't wait to hear everything you have to share. So why don't we dive right in, and you can tell us a little bit about yourself. You are a speech therapist, so yourself as a speech therapist and your journey with AAC.
Yeah. So like you said, I am a speech therapist, and I've been in the field for 4 years as a school-based SLP. But before that, speech therapists had a huge impact on my life and my family's lives. I am the oldest of 6 kids, and there are, of my 5 siblings, 4 of them had speech therapists, and 2 of them still do. So I have 2 brothers who just had run-of-the-mill speech sound disorders, and then I also have 2 sisters that have Down syndrome. And my sister Bridget is my biological sister, and then Alina is adopted, and Alina is also an AAC user. And so from her experience with her supports with her speech therapists, with both her and Bridget, that just had such a profound impact on me as a kid, just through observation and seeing what their speech therapists supported them to learn and grow and do. I was just enamored. And that led me to the field, and I still learn so much from them. And it's really just, it shaped my perspective as a person, but as a professional, and especially with my view and value for AAC.
That is amazing. And you were totally destined to be a speech therapist. How cool is that? I mean, you were like surrounded with it your whole life. I mean, yeah, it was meant for you.
Yeah. Well, and then funny enough, my other little sister, the only other one who did not have speech, she's actually studying to be an OT. So we joke That's that awesome. We just have a little, related service duo between the 2 of us.
That's so perfect. And you work in a school system and a private practice. Do you also see kids who use AAC there?
So I have kids on my school caseload who use AAC. With the private practice, I see kids from early intervention age. And then in my school experience, I have been in primarily elementary age. And so I've gotten to see a really good kind of range of very emergent AAC users, students who really have just had their first, access and experience with AAC, between high tech and low tech. And then I also have had students who have had their devices for a few years and are really on that journey of like them getting the buy-in and seeing the power of it. And I hope that in the rest of my career that I just get to see even more, people who use AAC in a variety of capacities. It's like, I have never seen 2 experiences that have been the same. And so I want to keep seeing more. And I learn so much from each case.
Absolutely. That's why I always tell people, like, we can set these like general guides for what you're supposed to do with AAC, but it never looks exactly the same. What strategy you use and how you like maneuver it to make it just right for that kid is always going to look a little bit different. So I love that perspective for sure. Okay, so we're going to take a trip down memory lane for everybody. Give us some insight as to what AAC look like for you growing up? Like, what do you remember? And then if you have anything to share about like your family's perspective of it, feel free to throw that in there too.
Yeah. So, yeah, taking a trip down memory lane. My sister Alina is now 17, and we adopted her when she was 3, and I was 14. So I remember being in middle school and just seeing the whole process with her adoption and bringing her home when she was 3. And then she right away, of course, got her preschool evaluation. And she started preschool with my sister Bridget. They are 9 months apart. And so they were in the same preschool class. And Bridget and Alina are so massively different. They both have Down syndrome. But anything that one has a strength in, the other one has a harder time in. And anything that one enjoys and is interested in, the other one doesn't really care for. So, like, I was 10 when Bridget was born, and I saw her go through early intervention, and I saw her early communication development, and she was delayed in her communication, but she primarily was intelligible in her speech once she developed verbal communication. But when we brought Alina home, she is Ukrainian, and they spoke Russian in her orphanage in the area that she was born in. And so we were interested to see, as she learned English, just like how her communication developed, because we saw how Bridget's communication developed, and we were wondering what kinds of words she would learn, and we supplemented with sign and started to teach her words. But as she was learning English, we realized that she, for almost every single word, it was some iteration of "g." Like, that was it. That was her whole consonant repertoire. And we then later realized that it was because she has apraxia. And so she was highly unintelligible when she first learned to speak. And that was when different forms of AAC were first introduced. And first, she supplemented her speech with some signs. And I remember the first kind of AAC that they had trialed with her was a Big Mac switch to say that she needed to go to the bathroom. And so in preschool, that was like the first most functional thing for her at the time. And she was using this Big Mac switch. And then she also had like PECS, where she had a PECS book, but didn't do a full like PECS protocol. And so I remember seeing, I think especially hearing something have a voice output, for me, I was so interested by it, because that's just not something that you see in like typical schooling, especially. I just remember like in school growing up, there wasn't a lot of inclusion of students with disabilities, of course, and I had never seen technology like that. And once she kind of grasped that and was using it to communicate beyond what she could verbalize, I was, like I said, like fascinated. It was just like, that's just what I remember the most. And after that, they've used a Go Talk. So they, it was like slow but steady increase over time. And so then she had to Go Talk 9, and she took it home. That was one thing. I remember that she brought it home, and it would hang up, like we had a mud room where we would hang up our backpacks, and next to her backpack, she had her little Go Talk hanging on the hook. But I remember feeling like it didn't give her that much. Like 9 little squares and 9 little words I was like, Bridget learned so many more words at a time, I felt like, and she had the opportunity to use so many more words. And so seeing something with that few, I couldn't really understand how like that was equitable almost. And so that was kind of the end of her like low and mid tech AAC use. And then that's when, so it was after preschool and kindergarten, she was using like low and mid tech AAC. And in first grade was when she got her first high tech AAC device.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, very
the beginning,
interesting. Yeah. No, and I think it's so interesting because she is, you said 17 now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was a very standard AAC protocol back in the day. And you said Big Mac and I just giggled because like that is like a go-to starting point for so many people. And although it is really simple to like program one nice quick phrase on there, and it's a perfect supplement to a bigger system. It's like such a perfect history that highlights like that we used to think there was a hierarchy. We had to go Big Mac and then PEX and then Go Talk. And then here we are 5 years later and here you can have a device.
Yeah.
So I'm sure too, like your thought process on that, like, or your like view of it, it's limiting. It's incredibly limiting. So if you are listening today and you are going through that hierarchy, know that it doesn't exist. There is no hierarchy. She very easily could have started with a high-tech device. Now, granted, high-tech devices back then were huge and bulky and like that's its own other category. But do you know what her first one was?
Yeah. So actually, she went straight to just an iPad with Proloquo. At the time, like that's what she was able to get funding for. And so, like you said, like comparatively, that was pretty like sleek and able to be transported. But she had it in a chat bag. And so it was like a drawstring bag almost that was meant to go around the device and still have the screen able to be accessed, but also carried. And this chat bag was bulky. So it was like the device itself ended up being pretty like light and able to be transported, but then the actual ability to like transport and access it with greater independence wasn't quite there.
Okay. Yes, we've made lots of developments in recent years with all things AAC. So, okay, what did it look like using the device at home? From the start, I know that's you have a huge span of memory lane to walk through, but what do you remember about actually using it at home?
Yeah. So I remember first when I saw her Proloquo set up, she would have been like between 7 and 8 years old, and I was getting close to graduate high school. And so when I was, and this was also when I realized that I wanted to be a speech therapist, was like, it was at this exact same time. I was getting ready to go to college and had like, I was figuring out what I wanted to declare as my major and do with my career. So I was looking at it from the perspective of like, what is this tool and what does it offer her? Because at that point, like at home before that point, most of her needs, and I hear this so much now as a professional talking to families, we anticipated her needs. We knew when if there was like a sign approximation, we knew what she meant by it. If she had a word approximation, no one else would be able to understand what it was that she wanted or needed. But at home, we were able to meet her needs and anticipate her needs. But it was always for me that wondering of what is beyond her needs. What does she want to communicate, and what can she communicate that's beyond those, I want to play with this, I want to eat this, I want to do this. It was all very concrete here and now. And I always felt so just curious of what more she had to say that she didn't yet have the tools provided to her to be able to do so. And so when we started using her AAC device, I remember the biggest things that stood out to me were the things that she could say for social interaction that she hadn't been able to before, even if it was just things like my turn or please or thank you. Like those were words that they're pretty like minor seeming, but it really was beyond what she had previously been able to communicate. And so that idea for me of like unlocking something for someone by having that tool available to them, just really sparked my interest in continuing to learn about AAC for her. But then also I felt so excited, and still this is what gets me so excited about the field, is getting to do that for other people too.
Yeah, no, I really love that perspective, because so often we hear the request rhetoric, like we'll start with requests. And in school, a lot of times I can see that being a need, because teachers change frequently, speech therapists change frequently, peers change frequently. We don't always know those nuances of a communication. And schools typically kind of like moving the ball along unless you get private therapy, and then they're incorporating stuff too. But when it comes to home, when it comes to a new place, like where they need to communicate to, like you said, so many people already anticipate those needs. And I've always kind of thought, if we know what they want, we don't need them to say it a different way, right? That's the whole purpose of like honoring all communication. If she was getting her point across to you guys, we didn't have to go back to the device and say Apple just because we needed to learn Apple. So you really, I mean, at such a young age in high school, graduating high school, already saw this like beautiful picture of, but there's more. There's so much more in there. There's so much more to unlock, and the social pieces and the comments and the humor that I see kids come out with, you're like, this is amazing. I had no idea you had it in you, just because there was no way to know. So that's really unique. I love it. So kind of switching directions, still thinking memory lane, but what do you remember as some barriers to AAC? Because I'm sure there were.
Yeah. So I think, and like also chronologically, this lines up really well. There's a couple different points with the introduction of high-tech AAC. Okay. Of course, I remembered like I said, like my view of it and just that kind of being enamored by it. But then talking to my mom and kind of getting a little bit more information about like from her perspective, her caregiver perspective. No one really explained the device to her, to my mom, being her. And I think this is where part of the barriers in the school system really comes into play, because my sisters never had private therapies. They always got all of their services either through early intervention or through the school systems. And so I think that's also kind of a unique case, at least from the students that I have had and other families that we've known. A lot of people with complex communication needs, they end up getting additional private therapies. And a lot of times the AAC support and carryover really comes in from those private therapies. And that's the hard part with school-based services, is we don't have that time for parent and caregiver training and support and continued troubleshooting and problem solving that is so necessary for that adequate and appropriate carryover. Because my mom said, she was like, I didn't understand how to use it. Like, she didn't know anything about modeling or just having the device out and available at all times, or she didn't know how to customize it. She didn't know all of the vocabulary that was pre-programmed into it. And so she really came at it from the perspective of like desiring and wanting it to be used and involved, but that there wasn't really that bridge that was built between home and school. So that was kind of
Yeah.
one of the
And
first barriers.
yeah, and that's something every parent who has come on this podcast or family member that has come on so far, and I'm sure everyone that will come on in the future, that is still a huge, huge barrier. I mean, one of the people we had on, her son has had a device less than 4 years, and no one taught her how to use it. No one explained it. And it becomes this really difficult thing, right? Because we need to support families with it. If we're going to send it home from school, like, we need to be able to provide some type of support. But we also typically, as a school-based SLP, have very limited time to do anything else except for like the required therapy services. And that's just it becomes a huge advocating piece on our behalf and on the parents' behalf. I mean, I think it can go both ways, and we're going to have an advocacy episode on in a few weeks, and I'm really excited about that. But parents can advocate for more support. SLPs can advocate for more support. It's going to take time, but it's there. It can happen. There are beautiful places where it does. It's just one day, right? One day.
Right. One day we'll have, all the staffing and support that we need to be able to do the things that we know are best practice and that we know work. And that's for me, like, as a school-based SLP now, like, I see her, like, my sister's previous teams and SLPs and intervention specialists. Like, I have so much empathy and compassion for them because I am in the trenches. Like, I know how hard it is to get those supports all on all fronts on the same page and providing supports. But it also, like, there really isn't the right answer and the right way to do it for the way that services are provided now in the schools. But that's what made me, so, like, for the last few years that I've been in the schools as a providing SLP, I've really tried to find ways that don't use a lot of time on my end to help support families, whether it's like a Google form for them to fill out with customization requests, or if it's a handout that I can send home, or a YouTube tutorial, or even just a picture from a session of what we modeled on the student's device. That there are these kind of time efficient and time saving ways that we can try to bring families in, even when it's not required, quote unquote, based on the IEP services.
Yes. And I really like that, because we are living in a world now, and I think this was probably less true for your mom years ago, but we have access to the YouTube. We have access to accounts that, like, you respect and can follow on Instagram and share those with families. And we have resources that, even if you're not the one making the resources, you can buy them from other people on Teachers Pay Teachers and hand them out. So there's so many ways. I love the video too. If you get permission from everybody involved, first and foremost, permission from everyone involved. I used to send them to families just so they could see what happened or what cool things happened. And then it allowed them too to kind of take a look at what it looks like and how it operates. So love those ideas. What other barriers did mom come up with?
Yeah. So this was one that my mom and I had kind of talked about, that I have kind of nicknamed the dark ages in my sister's AAC experience. Because another thing that we experience a lot in the schools is changing in staffing and changing in teams that support a student. And so that was something that happened to my sister. She had pretty consistent speech therapists from preschool through like mid-elementary school. So about 2 years after she started using her first device, she had a change in her SLP. And again, I come at this with the utmost compassion and empathy for the SLP, because I can only imagine that she had high caseloads. And I remember, like, my mom and I had talked about how this SLP in particular, like, was on maternity leave for part of one of the years. And these are all, I mean, situations that we encounter every day in the schools, with just the reasons and that teams change and the barriers that we come against in our positions. But there was about 2 years that my sister's device was barely utilized, that she really, there was not an emphasis placed on using and incorporating her device. And she really didn't grow in, well, the device didn't grow with her, and her skills in using her device really were stagnant for those couple years. And I think one of the things that is most disappointing to me in this time in her experience was that it was when her literacy skills were blowing out of the water. This is when, like, it was this like 3rd to 5th grade chunk of time in her education where she was reading and she was learning sight words and she was learning, early spelling patterns, and she was writing on everything. Like, her literacy was exploding. And I look back on it as a time that, like, her use of AAC in conjunction with those literacy skills, I feel like would have just flourished, but it really wasn't a priority. And so that's why, I've aptly dubbed it the Dark Ages, because it was a couple years of, device abandonment.
Yeah, that sounds very appropriate. And I think in my experience, just talking to a bunch of families and caregivers and even AAC users in general, there typically is some type of ebb and flow to use, unless you're getting in from the start with somebody who's like really consistent and sticks with you the whole time. It does. It has a lot of ebb and flow to it. And I like the combination of the literacy, though. Like, what a cool opportunity that really could have been to just kind of, like you said, blow it out of the water and make it even that much more successful. Mm-hmm. So any other barriers, or you want to tell us about some successes?
I think chronologically, like, we're getting into a better time in her history with AAC after the Dark Ages. And so I think kind of like shifting into things that have been really powerful supports. I'd like to kind of cover a couple of those if that sounds good.
Yes, let's do it.
Perfect. Okay, so after this phase, we are now entering middle school era. And so, mind you, she got her first device in 1st grade. She still had the same iPad equipped with Proloquo. And she moved to a middle school. So a new school with a new team. And at this point, this is when I was in grad school. And so I was learning about different AAC systems and what those look like. And I was really thinking about Alina's changing needs and just the amount of growth that she had, and really thinking about what the best system might be for her with moving into a new school and with a new team, because it was kind of an opportunity for something new in a good way. So we kind of had that, lapse in supports being carried over, but then wanted to take advantage with this new transition, just with bringing in some new systems. And so when Alina went to middle school and was in 6th grade and she was up for funding for another device, she trialed LAMP, and then she trialed Touch Chat with Word Power. And a lot of the input, and I was doing this all kind of from afar because I was in Cincinnati in grad school, and then my family is in Columbus. And I was talking to my mom just about, with these trials, what she felt with the softwares. Yeah. If she felt, my mom felt like she understood how the softwares were set up, how what the layout was like, because I hoped that her input in combination with what Alina did well with would help with some of that carryover. And so she ended up going with Touch Chat with Word Power, and she got her device right before the pandemic. And so at that point, it ended up, I'm so glad that we went with something that then my mom felt comfortable and confident with, because she was then the primary support in Alina then learning how to use her device because she was home full time then. And
Yeah.
so then I continued to kind of consult and support as far as device customization, helping troubleshoot where it made the most sense to kind of put different things in her vocabulary, what kind of vocabulary made sense to have in her device versus what made sense to use, her verbal communication to communicate, because Alina is multimodal communicator. She now at 17, she is so proud of her device, and she's decided to call it her device. She's always like, my device. But then she also says my voice. So she knows that there's certain things that are intelligible that she can say. And so she'll say my voice if she wants to speak it with, spoken word. And then she says my device if she wants to use her device to communicate it.
That's
And
awesome.
so now we're in, right, since like sixth grade to now in high school has been this period of just immense growth in her confidence and her buy-in. And that was a big shift too. That was a huge strength, was Alina's buy-in to her device and her motivation to use it again beyond just that like requesting, or like it was also kind of used as like a question machine from adults at school
Yep.
of like, this is how we're going to gauge her knowledge and understanding is through the device. But the shift with her new device, with touch chat and her buy-in and my mom's buy-in and understanding, that was like the trifecta to support her actual like implementation and growth with it.
That's really cool. I love that. It's such like ownership on her behalf, and probably even more ability to see who she is in words, even more than you were able to before. And the highlight of, one, how convenient it was that you were studying it and able to support it, because I'm sure pandemic time was also not a great time to be able to support lots of kids on a caseload and learning a new system in general too. But the point you make too, where you wanted to make sure your mom was comfortable with it, is so, so important. We want to pick the right system for the AAC user. Absolutely. But we also want to make sure that the primary caregiver is on board. Because when they're not, the carryover at home gets a lot more difficult, and then you don't necessarily see that transition back and forth. And that's something I know in a private setting, when you're like in a private practice and doing an AAC eval, it's very easy to do that. But when you're there, also think about the teachers that are going to have the kids all day. And when you're in a school, you can still include the family in this decision-making process. You can send videos home. You can send the actual devices home. It really does need to be that full like team support.
Yeah. So I felt so lucky to get to be a part of that team. For me, even before I was this, kind of weird combination of like, I'm going to be a clinician one day, and I am a family member and support person for an AAC user. So
Yeah.
I felt really lucky to also get to be a part of that process for her. And that I still get to be a part of her, AAC community. It really is a full community of the people around the AAC user that are learning the system and helping implement the system, because there's so much that Alina now can talk about and communicate with other people beyond just, wants and needs. She can communicate her preferences, and I think one of the biggest things that was a huge shift for me in seeing how she used her device was when she started asking questions for the first time. Like as a teenager,
That's cool.
It was like all of a sudden I remember she saw the question words folder in touch chat, and I was kind of thinking about like, okay, like, could she ask questions? What questions would she ask? Like, what is she curious about? And it was just like, at some point, she just like started asking about what other people thought, or if they like something, or beyond just kind of the concrete. Like, I feel like we always go over with kids how to ask like about people's favorite color and ask about, you know, their favorite food, but
Yeah.
really asking beyond that of like, how do you feel? Like, hearing her ask questions like, how do you feel for the first time? um I I don't know if I would have anticipated like her doing that necessarily. And so getting to see just those more abstract like thoughts and connections that she was making felt so special. And it makes me even more excited just to see what she continues to develop, because even though she's 17 and she only has a few years of like school-based services left,
Yeah.
she still is making so much growth. And I think sometimes when we think of students that have significant supports for their whole schooling career, there isn't always a lot of projection for growth, of significant growth. And it's hard to
Yeah.
anticipate like the type of growth that a student is going to make. But even students that have high support needs, regardless of what they are, like there's always opportunity for learning a new skill or making growth in areas that we don't anticipate.
Yeah. And I like to highlight in this lifetime model here, she was in this like middle school era, and it wasn't going well. The device wasn't being used well. And I've been in high school. I've worked in high school. I've seen high school, and typically kids get written off in some context when they make it to high school. And it's not necessarily for any fault of anybody. So I'm not blaming anybody. Just in my experience, there's a lot of like, oh, well, you know what? It wasn't going well, so we just stopped using it because we weren't making progress and we weren't doing this and we weren't doing that. And you guys did something where you switched gears. You tried something new. You went to something different. And in her high school years, like, she's flourishing. She's learning so much. She's growing. So we have to remember that growth doesn't stop in the early ages. Like, you can start in high school and skyrocket with your language skills. It doesn't have to be just the little kids in EI and preschool get it, and elementary, and then by the time we get to high school, we're just in high school. And granted, there are kids with very significant complex needs, and it's always going to be a process of kind of navigating through that and figuring that out. But it's really important that we keep trying.
Yeah, and like you said, like in those early intervention in preschool and early elementary school, I think we see a lot of like bursts of growth, and then kind of it's at a different rate or a different pace when kids do have supports long term. But even like with Lena, one thing that really benefited her with Touch Chat specifically was that then a lot of grammatical structures that she cannot produce verbally, she started to pick up and understand once she had it visually and on her device. She's adding past tense verb inflections and plural nouns, and she has gotten punctuation and is understanding that when she's asking a question and she adds a question mark, that her device says it differently, that it says it with inflection. Like, there are all these things that she would never have had access to use and understand if we were only relying on her spoken language. So then using her device as that supplement, it taught her the skills, and now she's like, she loves it. She thinks it's so cool that she can add things and that it changes the meaning, and her device says it differently. And so it's not just even something like that, like working on grammar, of course, isn't going to be the first thing that you start working on with a device, but remembering some of those skills that like you can still scaffold in and teach, and someone can learn and pick up even after 10 years of having exposure to high-tech AAC, there's always more to be able to teach and learn, and it's not going to be particularly relevant for every single communicator. They might not get excited about their device asking a question with inflection, but for the people that it is motivating and interesting to, for us as clinicians, remembering that it's really not about what we want them to be able to say or do. It's purely about what they want to be able to participate in.
Yeah. And you beat me to my question, actually, because I was going to ask, like, what were some of the reasons for word power over Proloquo to go?
Mm-hmm.
And so Proloquo to go, just to be clear for anybody listening, does have punctuation in it, and it does have grammar in it, but they're not necessarily visible. Like the grammar, you have to hold the button and open it, where like on Touch Chat, you actually see the ED button and you see the punctuation button.
Yes.
That alone to me is like a nice distinct feature difference where I could see word power being more successful.
Yeah, and that's exactly, for her, I think why the word power has been so helpful, because it does also make it faster and easier for her to navigate for some of those things. And especially as her complexity of her communication has expanded, having it be able to be accessed that much quicker has helped her have less breakdowns in her communication, because sometimes that just purely the time that it takes to put messages together kind of shuts down a communicative interaction before it's even happened. And so for her, it's also been kind of a balancing act of what can we have programmed in there to help with the efficiency of her communication, while also not sacrificing her learning language and expanding her language and her ability to navigate her device. It really is a fine line and a balance of pre-programmed phrases that make sense to put in there, and having things quickly accessible literally at her fingertips, to be able to kind of quickly interact as well.
Yeah, and there's so much power in the fast communication, and I think that applies for literally everyone using AAC. It doesn't have to be once you get to that more complex language. I always use the example of like, "Mom, come here quick." Like, that's an emergency. Like, I need you right now. But to find all of those words, it's going to take like a solid minute to put together. Like, it's okay to put phrases in a device. But like you said, with that fine line of like, we still want to learn language at the same time. So we're not putting every phrase in the book in your device.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So let's kind of start our wrap up here.
Yeah.
We're going to kind of end with some lessons and or advice. So let's start with speech therapists. If you had to give like one, maybe two pieces of advice, what would you give?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing for speech therapists with AAC is just doing it. Like, I think that there's a lot of hesitation to not do it wrong, that we don't want to jump into it and not, get the implementation, not pick the exact right software and hardware and with the exact right layout. It's okay if it's not the exact right everything the first time around. Just like with my sister, we've gone through multiple different softwares. We've gone through multiple different communication systems, and really the only wrong one was not using it. And so for SLPs, like that's it. That's just doing AAC, and not having that fear of doing it wrong, because not doing it, like I said, not doing it is the wrong thing. And
yes.
then
I love that message.
Yeah. And then
I love it. I
think for both SLPs and caregivers, I also think giving as much opportunity and focusing the person and what they want to say at the center of it, and thinking outside of our own projections of how we think someone will communicate or how we think they'll grow, and giving as many open-ended opportunities for communication and connection as possible.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I love it. I was totally not going to bring this up, but I have like a framework that I use in my online course. And at the base of it is the AAC user. Like they are the thing. And then the three like foundational pillars are the device, your mindset, and the environment. And you will look like you just said all three of them because they are. If you don't have the right device, it's going to be tricky. If you don't have that mindset that like, I just need to get started, I just need to do it, mistakes are going to happen, it's going to be okay, you're going to have a hard time. And if you don't have an environment set up with opportunities to genuinely communicate, not like I'm going to ask for the goldfish every time you hand me a goldfish, like genuine communication, connection opportunities, AAC is going to be really challenging. So Sara, this was wonderful. I loved everything about it. So thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, for getting to talk about my experience, my family's experience. I appreciate the opportunity to get to share just what I've learned through both my clinical experience and as an SLP, but more than anything, my experience as a big sister to Alina and her AAC use it's been so changing for me. So I appreciate getting to share it.
Absolutely. I think it's a really unique perspective to hear from a sibling, especially. So thank you again. I really appreciate it. All right, everyone. What an awesome episode with Sara. I think it's so powerful to hear family stories, and I try to bring you guys as many of those as possible. And I think it was really fascinating to hear her perspective as a sibling. And she was like middle school, high school, college level when she was watching this. So, she like really experienced it kind of even in a different perspective than a younger sibling might. So, and clearly it sparked her interest in the AAC field a lot. So for this week's action step, we're really going to kind of break down some of those barriers and some of those kind of mindset shifts and better expectations for ourselves. So what I want you to kind of do is I want you to take a couple minutes and sit down and write down some of your barriers. What is getting in your way? What is challenging you? And let's kind of make a T-chart with it. So what's really hard? What about this process is challenging or you have questions about? And then after you go ahead and do that, take a little bit, look at those, and then see if there's another way that we can look at those or another support we can put in place to address those. So maybe your barrier is not being able to have access to the AAC device all the time. So obviously we want to aim for access to the device all the time. So what type of supports could we put in place that would make that an achievable expectation and an achievable goal for you? So as always, there is a handout and resource available in the Take Action Podcast resource library. The link for that is below, and we will see you next week on the Take Action Podcast.